Well, good afternoon, everyone. If it's afternoon for you, good evening in Paris and Warsaw, good morning in parts of Asia and Australia, and hello in the United States. I'm Fred Plotkin, and those of you who join me each Friday know that this is Adagio's Fred Plotkin on Fridays, in which I speak every week to someone who inspires me or has created something inspirational. And many of the people you've met have been performing musicians or arts administrators. I've had a couple of authors, and today's author has written a really fantastic book. And I'm not saying this because I know her, but it's really a fantastic book. Chasing Chopin, a musical journey across 3 centuries, 4 countries, and half a dozen revolutions. And the author and my friend is Annik LaFarge. Welcome, Annik.
Thank you, Fred. It's such a great pleasure to be with you on this great
Thank
show
you.
that you do.
Um, Today's focus, given the title of the book, will be Chopin. And listeners know that much of what I've focused on so far has been vocal music, choral music, big orchestral music. But today's theme, if I can put it in one word, is intimacy and the mirror that music can create to one's own soul, whether you are the performer playing the music, the composer who has written this music, or the audience member who is hearing this music with a real sense of intimacy. And in the case of Annik Lafarge, someone who has lived with one particular piece of music, the Opus 35, which contains the famous funeral march. It's a sonata. And she wrote something in this wonderful book that I want to quote to you just directly. The sonata begins almost with a sigh and then it rampages. What does that mean, Annik?
Well, it means that um, I mean, one of the things that so astounded me about this whole work, and particularly the funeral march, but also really all of Chopin's works, is how it combines those juxtaposing elements, those contrasts. And he does this frequently, and he does it brilliantly and very effectively, for instance, in the B minor scherzo, which rampages in the beginning, and then in the middle, it breaks into this traditional Christmas cradle song in Poland, and then it rampages again. And it's one of the things that I've always found really powerful about Chopin's work, but also really very authentic and kind of mirroring the way life can be, that you don't always know what's coming at you. But it's going to be a maelstrom, and it's going to be also perhaps a gentle wind as well. And you get those two things, and so that's what happens with that sonata. It starts that way, and of course in the funeral march, which I'm sure you're going to get to, it has an astonishing, and for many people who are not classical music people, who know it as the kind of iconic pop culture dirge, everything from cartoons to state funerals. It has this hidden kind of, really lovely major key moment in the middle of the funeral march that also captures what you were getting at before about the rampaging and the sigh.
The key change goes from B flat minor to D flat major and then back to B flat minor. And I want to tell listeners right now that once we are done with our conversation, they should go to a website that you've created called Why Chopin, WHY Chopin.com. Um, Annik and I were once collaborating on a book, and it was an art book, and I had the idea to create a website that would list and show the works of the artists that I was discussing. And it's a good idea. I think this is the way certain good books can work now. People cannot necessarily travel to see every work by every great artist, and nor can they necessarily have access to the music. And because you range very widely in the inspirations and the references and the citations of this Opus 35 sonata, you provide examples on the website. And part of my joy in reading this book was stopping at a certain point and putting the book down and opening up the website and listening to the performances that you indicate. So one of them, a work that I've heard countless times, is a song by Cole Porter, Every Time We Say Goodbye. And you chose Annie Lennox to sing it beautifully. And there is the famous line that I never quite paid attention to before: how strange the change from major to minor.
Yeah.
You connect in a very valid way, I will say. It's not light and it's not frilly. The many ways that one work by one composer can inspire so many other kinds of creativity in music, in this case, but also other kinds of works. And similarly, and this is the first thing I want to get to with you on this, the way a composer draws inspiration from the people who came before. It is a lineage. And similarly, when we talk about teachers of musicians, let's take singing teachers, piano teachers, violin teachers, we talk about these musicians being in the school of. In other words, their teacher studied with so-and-so, who studied with so-and-so, who studied with so-and-so, who studied with Eric Satie, who studied with someone else, going practically back to Bach, and they all seem to go back to Bach.
A great piano teacher, or not necessarily, not
with
piano
his books,
precisely, but a great teacher of the keyboard himself.
Yes, and we'll talk about Chopin later and his using the well-tempered clavier. In your life and work as a writer, as an amateur musician, do you see yourself in this continuum? And if so, where and connected to whom?
Well, I'm an amateur. I'm an ardent and longtime amateur. But I always emphasize the fact, and in fact, Chopin wrote for amateurs. Chopin wrote with amateurs in mind. So for those of us who play him, it's very accessible. It's very intimate. You talked earlier about the simplicity. I think that's another thing that was really very important to him. He once said something to the effect that he said, "No noises, no effects, just simplicity as in all that is beautiful." And that was that was kind of his credo. For me, there was this one moment, I write about it in the book, where I was learning the third movement, the Funeral March movement in Opus 35. And I was sitting with my teacher, and we were using the Urtext score. And so Chopin's fingerings were, he didn't finger everything, but he did include certain fingerings. And at one point, Raphael, my teacher, said, "Well, it'll be easier for you to do just a stepwise 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. That's where the hand wants to fall." And then the next week, he took it back and he said, "Actually, no, Chopin's fingering, where Chopin asks you to lift your wrist up and take your fourth finger and bring it down first on an F and then on an E flat." He said, "That's better because that makes you bring your wrist up and then drop it with the weight, and you can really sing. You can bring the pad of your finger right down on that note." In fact, I told you I was going to maybe mention the end papers, the beautiful end papers that Simon & Schuster allowed us to put in here. But there is, you can't really see it, but there's a pencil mark.
Okay, yeah.
There's a pencil mark here that has the number 4, and that's the pencil mark where the instruction was. So when my teacher said that, that's when I felt connected. That's when I felt, that his methodology of teaching goes back to Dorothy Taubman, whose work you probably know, who really was one of the first people to understand the impact of repetitive stress. She worked with Leon Fleischer, for instance, after he injured himself and allowed him to resume his concertizing career. If you play Chopin the way he taught, you play the way that my teacher was talking about, without tension, lifting the wrist, dropping the hand. Chopin was almost futuristically interested in the anatomy of the human body. So this appendage of fingers and ligaments and wrist and forearm and shoulder that pianists use to create a beautiful sound. But the physical qualities were very much implicated in the beauty, in the quality of the sound. And Chopin didn't have the language that we have today about repetitive stress and tension and release and all of that. And Taubman really kind of pioneered that and taught my teacher. So just to answer your question, so in that moment where he says, no, don't use the 5-4-3-2-1. Use the 4-4 as Chopin indicated it, because that's going to get you that beautiful singing tone, that tone that all pianists, and particularly Chopin, prized above all else. That kind of, I felt, I saw the dominoes going back and forth from my teacher through his teacher and his, and all the way back. And that's the way those continuums do work, I think, is there is a connection. And those composers live not only through their works, but also through their teaching and the things that they told their students, who then recorded them. And that's a lot of how we know about what Chopin was like as a teacher, and also as a pianist himself, was through the records of his students.
When I've studied, and then when I've taught music, and this is a broad generalization, in talking about the great musicians and artists of the 19th century in Europe, primarily in Germany, France, and Italy, but also elsewhere, and Vienna, they tend to talk about the radicals and the conservatives. Mm-hmm. So that the radical line might be Beethoven, Berlioz, Wagner. The conservatives might be Haydn, Brahms, maybe Mendelssohn in there before, take your pick. And I've often seen Chopin put among the conservatives, the traditionalists. Mm-hmm. This is not a political thing. This is an artistic expression. Do you think that's a good description of him, to rank him in those traditionalists, or would he be a radical?
I think that at the time his music was very, it was, I mean, Robert Schumann complained, he loved Chopin's music. He said, hats off, a genius, to the Lacidarum variations. But he also felt that for instance, the last movement, the finale of the Opus 35 Sonata, which takes 70 seconds to play or something, it's 74 measures, I think. It goes really, really quickly, and it verges on the brink of atonality. It's completely athematic. And that made Schumann crazy. I think that was, and there's a reason, there's a reason the jazz musicians love Chopin so much. Yeah. His music, he did a lot of polyrhythms in some of his works, his ballades and other works, and so, it wasn't until, I think it was the 1920s, that a musicologist named Ugo Lechtentrick kind of rescued the reputation of Chopin, which had been the sort of the poet of the piano, somebody who composed for the ladies, sentimental, small. This thing about small, really, that of all the things that make me crazy, that really does, because it takes an Elizabeth Bishop or a W.H. Auden to write a villanelle, but we don't criticize them for writing in a small form. He's known as the poet of the piano for a reason, but it's not because he didn't have the capacity to write in larger forms. It's because for him, the smaller forms, the very distilled forms, that's what he had to say. And you feel in Chopin often that there is just never a wasted note. That it's very economical. And so I don't know, I think it took a long time for the scholarly world to regard him, and this sonata in particular, as the innovator that he was. And then everything kind of changed with modern musicology in the early parts of the 20th century. So I don't know, I think what we call a radical or conservative, maybe those are labels that don't work terribly well when we're talking about 18th and 19th century artists. And Chopin was surrounded by rule breakers. And I write about those. I read, Eugène Delacroix, the painter, completely going against genre and form. Georges Sand, his lover for 9 years. Astolphe de Custine, this fascinating figure that I read about, who was a travel writer, among other things. So these guys were all in this really, Paris was called the capital of the 19th century. The early years of the Industrial Revolution were transforming every aspect of art and culture, ballet, theater, dance, everything. And so I think that, that's the way, that was the way in which I approached the story, was looking at this really extraordinary period. I mean, I write about 3 years. It's a very short book. It covers a 3-year story of the composition of the Opus 35 Sonata. But it was 2 decades, and particularly the 1830s, of just really extraordinary innovation in technology. I mean, they would kind of, in a way, I think, recognize our culture and the ways in which modern technology have transformed the way that we interact with each other. In the 1830s, printing presses, steam-powered printing presses, were allowing newspapers to come out prodigiously and then create celebrities. And so there was this big celebrity culture, this virtuosity culture. Liszt versus Thalberg, they had these piano duels. And one of the things I admired about Chopin was the way he kind of walked away from all of that. He had the choice, had the chance to become a big celebrity, and really that was not what he was interested in doing. But so I think, so that's really my kind of way into this story, is through the period itself and the way that this moment enabled such really innovative artistic creation in every aspect.
I made a couple of notes to myself about the milieu that he lived in. He arrived in Paris in the fall of 1831, and there, or almost there, nearly there, were Rossini, Bellini, Donizetti, Franz Liszt, very important. He knew Robert and Clara Schumann. He had met Mendelssohn. I wrote down Delacroix, Berlioz, Gounod, and later, Grieg, Brahms, Verdi, Wagner, Meyerbeer all set foot in Paris, and some of them contributed a lot to Paris. What I know as an opera guy is that this period, the 1830s, the early 1830s, was when Henri Murger wrote Scènes de la vie de Bohème, which was the source material for Puccini's La Bohème. And we see so many productions of that opera set. Recently, there was one in Paris that set it on the moon. I've seen it set in contemporary times in the 1930s. I recently saw an excellent one in Turin that was set in sort of the fringes of a city, a European city generically, in the 1970s, and it worked very well. But the famous Franco Zeffirelli Met production of La Bohème is the most faithful to the time and place, and it exists on video with various casts, starting with Jose Carreras and Teresa Stratas, and many times since. And it is the most evocative of what visually Chopin would have known. And because he had periods of poverty, he lived, yes, for a while in the Place Vendôme, which is a very chic place to be poor, but it really communicates, that opera does, through the source material. I have no idea if Henri Murger knew Chopin, but he walked in the same circles and wrote about the same kinds of people. And one of the characters, Schaunard, in the opera is a musician. And I love going to paintings and novels and so on when I'm trying to discover something about a musician or a performer, an actor in a given time. Paris, well, I should ask you first, your name is Annik LaFarge, which would suggest to us that you're of French origin. Is that true?
Yes, long ago. I was named Annik after a cousin, although my mother always insisted I was named after a spaniel. So it's kind of, no one really knows for sure. But yeah, I have a lot of French cousins, and the original Jean LaFarge came from Paris on a land grant, actually, from Napoleon. And then
where did your family land in the United States or Canada or both, maybe?
New York, in a tiny little town called LaFargeville. It's up by the Thousand Islands. I've actually been there. I have a picture of me in front of the LaFargeville car wash, and other.
For listeners who may not know the area, many parts of the northern United States, especially the northeastern United States, had considerable French settlement, and very early on, actually, and the province of Quebec and Nouvelle-Brunswick, New Brunswick, and other parts of Eastern Canada are profoundly profoundly French. And they were known as Acadian. And these people, some of them moved down to Louisiana, which was part of France for King Louis, and transferred in effect from being Acadian to Cajun. And the language of parts of Louisiana and the cultural traditions reflect France. And in Tennessee Williams' play A Streetcar Named Desire, the character Stanley Kowalski talks about the Napoleonic Code and how in Louisiana we still live by the Napoleonic Code. You talk in the book about the Napoleonic Code in connection with George Sand.
Yeah.
Would you describe what that is and how she was affected or ignored the Napoleonic Code?
Was, you know, the Napoleonic Code was this set of laws that governed relations between people, land, property, marriage. They were established in 1804, and that was the year that George Sand was born. So she was like literally born into the beginning of the Napoleonic Code. And one of the things that's so remarkable about her story is that she also had both Chopin and Sand came from these sort of juxtaposing cultures. Chopin's father was French, his mother was Polish. Sand's, on her father's side, was actually descended from Polish kings, real aristocracy. On her mother's side, she was a peasant. Her father, her grandfather sold canaries on the Seine. And Georges Sand grew up in this very conflicting environment. When her father dies, a very young man, in a horseback riding accident, her very imperious grandmother basically paid off her mother to stay in Paris and allow the grandmother to raise little Aurore, as she was known then. And Georges Sand, that was the first betrayal, the first of several betrayals that broke her heart. The way she pleaded with her mother not to give me away for money, she said in a letter. But she grew up into a woman who, she made a very bad marriage. Her husband turned out to be kind of a scoundrel and a womanizer. Even worse, he didn't like music. He didn't like animals. Those were her two great passions. He straightened her garden paths, which to her was an enormous affront because she liked improvisational landscape as well as in art. And she turned to writing to liberate herself. She also she was a great theater goer. She started dressing as a man, mainly so she could go into the theater stalls the way men were allowed to. And she liberated herself with her pen. She was able to work the court system to not exactly, divorce was illegal, it didn't exist. So that was not really an option, but she worked the system to separate legally from her husband. She was allowed to keep her property, which went against the Napoleonic Code. She was able to keep custody of her children. And she went on to become a person of very controversial, because her politics and her social ideas were very controversial. She was both very conservative in certain ways and also very liberal in certain ways. She was a really, really complex woman. But she wrote with, I write about this book she wrote during the Majorca period, which is a very important period during the story of the Sonata, and also
briefly describe the dates of Majorca, and we'll get back to that later, but so our listeners have a context.
Yeah, they leave for Majorca they arrive in November of 1839, and they're there. They planned to stay for a long time, maybe a couple of years, but they ended up, because of his health, coming back in February of 1840. On
a ship that contained hundreds of pigs that were being tortured by the crew.
Right.
And she was an animal lover, so she was incensed by that. And apparently the smell and the noise really got to Chopin.
Yeah. No, it was it really, you read the accounts of this passage. And this was the first, kind of tourist conveyance that brought people to Majorca. It was considered to be a great place for Europeans to spend the winter season. And it turned out to be devastating to him particularly, because the weather was very cold and he got very ill. And they also dealt with all kinds of, I mean, they were unmarried. They were in a very Catholic country. They didn't really speak the language. George Sand was very critical of the people there. She thought they were stupid. She uses that word. She thought they were kind of bestial, and they didn't like her either. And they didn't like this, this whole setup with these children that were running wild of hers and
living in a converted Carthusian monastery.
Right. Right.
Yeah. We're going to get back to that, but continue. Yeah. Well, actually, let me pick up from here. George Sand, I did a little research about her because I thought I knew something about her, and I was right. And I want to bring it to our listeners' attention. She was the great-granddaughter of Maurice, Count of Saxe, who was Polish. He was the illegitimate son of a Polish king. And he lived from 1696 to 1750. Opera lovers know this guy because if you know the opera by Chilea Adriana Lecouvreur, the story of a famous French actress and her rival who was a countess, both of whom loved Maurice, who apparently was quite a ladies' man. And my reading about him, he was one of these men who was undone by his sexual activity because he had every disease you can contract, because he had many, many children and he was quite the figure. But in this opera, Chilea's Adrian Lecouvreur, he is Maurizio, who in the opera is a very likable, very noble person who loves Adriana Lecouvreur, but for the sake of his country and politics, has to play up to the Princess de Bouillon. And coincidentally, the current greatest interpreter of that role is the Polish tenor Piotr Beczava. The Met did it last year with Anna Netrebko, Adita Rakvelishvili in the two leading women's roles, and Piotr Beczava as Maurizio. So he brought Polish history with him and the Polish character and this nobility and so on. And it's a wonderful opera that is.
I have not seen it. Is it? Can you get it on?
I imagine the Met probably put it out on DVD, or they will, but there are other versions. Renata Tebaldi did it many, many years ago. And Corelli was Maurizio. And Placido Domingo made his Met debut in 1968 as Maurizio with Tebaldi. So it's a wonderful role for tenor, and there are two great women's roles and wonderful minor roles. And it evokes beautifully the Parisian artistic milieu of the 18th century. But I love looking at operas and reading novels and finding characters who relate in ways that we don't know. So part of the musical and cultural continuum you and I were talking about exists in the character of Maurice, Maurizio, who is the great-grandfather of George Sand. And I'm sure she knew of him and about him.
Sure. And she was a great music lover and an accomplished pianist herself. But she very famously said, I was born in music, because her father was playing the violin as she was being delivered. So she really was sort of saturated in music her whole life. And one of the books that she wrote she wrote so many books. I mean, I wonder if there's anybody alive who's actually read every word that she wrote. There were, I think, a dozen in just the tiny little period that I focused on. But one of the books that she wrote during that period is called The Seven Strings of the Lyre, which was based on the Faust legend. And it really is her attempt to kind of deconstruct what music is made of through this love story and the sort of very complicated story of duality, which was a favorite theme of the Romantics, of sort of how we contain multitudes, which is very much what the the Faust legend is all about. And it's really, and I think, I sort of wonder, I speculate that during this period when she was with Chopin, they were talking about music all the time. I mean, he didn't write a lot about the making of music. In fact, we know a lot about his theories about music through George Sand, more because she did write quite a lot about his music making. But yeah, this was such a major part of their lives. I mean, I think every single, and when they were together, of course, in France during the summertime, where he taught in Paris during the winter, and then they would repair to France for the warmer months. The house was just filled with music all day long because he was playing. And then at night he would play for the guests and he would illustrate stories. He was a great mimic. He had a tremendously wonderful sense of humor. I think that's another thing about Chopin that I think, sort of goes against the stereotype. We think of the cliche of the sort of the tortured romantic. He was melancholic, he was effeminate, but he was enormously funny. And he used his music, even when he was a kid. There's stories about how he would narrate with music the stories that his friends would tell aloud about Polish kings and pirates and thieves in the night and stuff. So that music was really a part of the whole universe that they inhabited.
Would you talk about your father and music? There's a beautiful passage in your book about him, and I'm not going to tell it. I would like you to tell it, please.
Yeah, my father was a great music lover. Bach was his favorite, although Mozart, I remember I have visions of my dad lying on the floor listening to filling the house with Mozart. And when we were kids, there were four of us. We grew up in the city, and my parents instituted a nap time rule. We had to have a 3-hour nap every single afternoon during the weekends. And we could do anything we wanted. We didn't have to sleep. We just had to be quiet so that my father could listen to music. And when he died, what he asked us to do was to leave his body on his hospital bed. He died of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. He had been ill for several years. He knew the end was coming. And he asked that we leave him in his room for 24 hours and play a non-stop loop of the Bach cello suites. So that's what we did. So somebody in my family, I can't remember who it was so long ago, figured out how to do that technically, because those were in the days before there were, phones that could do such things. And sort of all day long, all night long, as we were all sort of coming and going and grieving and laughing and telling stories, the music of Bach filled the house. And it was really very moving and very powerful, because he wanted to be surrounded, by that music. That was the music that he loved best of all. So it was Pablo Casals, and it was quite remarkable. And that actually was the first. I mean, when you asked me for the handful of favorite works that inspire me that are in the Adagio catalog, I chose the G major cello suite because that was the first record I was ever given by our au pair when I think it was 13 or 14. And it made me a lifelong lover of Bach, but also it turned me on to classical music along with my father and my mother, who played the piano as well. Although she was more interested in her earlier years, she was more interested, like she played the score from the Fantastics and,
a musical. Yeah.
Yeah. But then
Did
later
your siblings get into music as well?
Not really. No, my brother's very musical, and he can just sit down and pick out any tune. But none of them has studied it diligently the way I did. And I started the way many kids do. I was forced to take lessons, and I had a bad teacher. And it wasn't until I was in my 30s that my partner Ann bought me what was then the sort of the state of the art in electronic keyboards. And the important thing was that they had the weighted keys, which was really important. They were much more piano-like. And so I found a really great teacher. And it just became a journey. It became a real kind of way of not only discovering music and making music and learning about music, but about learning about oneself. He warned me when in our first or second lesson, when you do this, it's like a form of psychotherapy.
Yes.
You're gonna confront every issue of your life, all your baggage, all your obstructions, all the things you do to undermine yourself.
Did your father or anyone for him bring music to the hospital, in the sense that, I'll tell you about my dad in a bit, but he was a musician.
Please.
And he died in a hospital. And when he was packing for what he knew would be the end, I made note of the music that he selected.
Really? What was it?
He brought CDs. He was a trombonist, a beautiful trombonist, who played both classical, jazz, big band, Broadway. And he brought everything from Stravinsky to Ella Fitzgerald. What was interesting was that he brought he was born in 1923, music that was contemporary music in his lifetime, in his early lifetime. So Stravinsky, Gershwin, Debussy, Ravel, composers like that, rather than Wagner or Mozart or people further back.
Right.
But the music that formed him, that was new and on the radio when he was a kid, and then when he began to play, he would pick up new pieces of music. So Gershwin and Ravel were the new composers at the time. And Alban Berg, for example. So he brought a
Right.
very strange, not strange bad, but strange, interesting mix of music. And coincidentally, Ella Fitzgerald died about 3 weeks before he did.
Oh, wow.
And my musical household had everybody in it. Duke Ellington, who you include in the book, always said there are two types of music, good music and the other kind.
Right.
And so we had good music of all types. And I noticed we knew my dad was going to die, but I noticed that when I had to bring him the news that Ella Fitzgerald had died, because he would have seen it in the New York Times anyway, so I thought it would better to tell him before, that's when he declined.
Really? Is
He
that right?
suddenly showed a dip right after
Wow.
that, because clearly that whole structure was taken away from him.
Wow.
I have worked a lot at the radio station, New York WQXR, and I
Sure.
was
Yeah,
not
I know.
officially at the time yet, but had many friends there, and one of whom, my dad, like myself, are night people, and Chopin writes night music. We're going to
Yeah,
get into that in a
that's
moment.
right.
But every night she would come on. Her name is Nimet Habashi, a longtime host of WQXR. And I asked Nimet, let me put it this way. My father knew the end was coming, and he couldn't verbalize everything because there was a mixture of sadness and fear and different issues, depression. And I programmed an hour on WQXR that only Nimet knew why. And it was music that I believed would speak to my father without my having to use language.
Wow.
Because by that point, he
Wow.
had said to me, I don't want to speak anymore in English, in spoken language. I just want music. But I felt that there were certain issues that were unresolved in his life, that I couldn't fix everything, obviously, but maybe I could help open those doors to help him resolve it. And what we programmed was Till Eulenspiegel's Merry Pranks by Richard Strauss, Beethoven's Seventh Symphony,
My
and
favorite.
the cinco canciones negros, the five songs of a black child, I think, by Xavier Monsalvace. And the last one of those is a lullaby. And Nimet, at the beginning of the hour, said, Edward, my father's name, this hour is for you. I know you're listening. And I sat in the hospital room at 11 p.m.
Oh my God.
a couple of days before he
Oh
died.
my.
And she played Till Eulenspiegel's Merry Pranks, which was his, when he would call me, he would whistle that theme, even as a little kid. And that's how I knew to come. So it was not language, it was not Freddie come here, it was he would whistle that. The second was Beethoven's Symphony, number 7, because of the arc of emotion in it, from very dramatic to festive. And then the 5 songs of Monsalvace, sung by Victoria de Los Angeles, his favorite singer, that end in a lullaby. And Nimet, I didn't ask her to do this, said at the end of it, Edward, I'm going to play that lullaby for you one more time.
Oh
And
my
she
God.
did. And then she went into her regular program, which always began with Debussy. And then I switched off the radio. And I turned to my father and I spoke. I didn't sing to him. And I said, do you understand what that music is about? He said, I do. He said, every piece helped me think through things. and I feel better now. And so
Wow.
after that, he never uttered another word.
Is that right?
And
Really?
I kept music on in the room for him, and I kept on WQXR. He died in July, and it was warm, and he had his own room in the hospital. And at the moment that he passed at 2:20 in the afternoon, July 13th, 1996, on the radio was Parto Parto, which is the aria by Sesto from Mozart's last opera, La Clemenza di Tito, The Clemency of Titus, which is about finding reconciliation in tragedy and acceptance. And Parto Parto means I'm going, I'm leaving. And I could not have planned that. But when you, Annik, were talking about
Wow.
the psychological resonance, what I call the mirroring of music in our lives, that is but one of many examples. And that's why I'm not a performer, but I chose a life in music.
Yeah.
In the way that I could, working in theaters and teaching music and reading wonderful books like yours, because we live with it for our whole lives, and it gives a depth and a complexity and a resonance that you so perfectly capture in this book. You are a writer, you are, as you said, an amateur musician. I'd like to read for listeners a paragraph, because not only the content of the paragraph, but the beauty of the writing. I think it's important that people understand that music happens in words as well. What follows Chopin's funeral dirge is one of the most perfectly beautiful pieces of music I had ever heard. It is hopeful, sweet, beckoning, a grown-up lullaby in which Chopin now says to the listener, "It's all right. I never left. I'm here with you still. Remember me in joy." You don't need to know a thing about harmony or music theory to actually feel how the movement from B flat minor to D flat major makes cosmic sense. The music has resolved itself in a way that simply feels natural. The trio, as this middle section is called, goes on for less than 30 measures. It's just a single page in the score, tracing a path through its new tonality and assuredly leading the way out of the somber, bone-crushing chords of the funeral march that set the stage for it. We have been taken to an entirely new place where the mood is brighter, gentler, dare I say happier. But then again, Chopin pulls the rug out from under us. With the trio over, he asks the performer for a tiny pause, and then the deep, hollow, minor key tones of the funeral march are back, inevitable in their steady, relentless pulse. In just 10 minutes or less, Chopin has bookended the entire human experience in music, taking us from lullaby to lament. That's gorgeous writing. And
Fred.
when I read
That's
it the
lovely.
first time, I felt a tear come down. It was not related to my father. It was just, that's one of the most beautifully expressed examples of what words can be used to explain music, because it's very hard to use words to explain music.
It is. Yeah.
And yet you did it. And I want readers to know that as just one example of what is, the book is 160 pages or so, but so compact. It's kind of like what you said about Chopin's music. There's nothing extraneous. And
Yes.
if one is not a musicologist, one would not lose out. One would gain by reading this book, because you go on, you take the theme, which is the Sonata number 35, and you go on many variations, some of them personal, most of them about Chopin, his life, and his world. So I don't have to have you say thank you for the writing, because thank you for the writing.
Well,
But um,
that's a lovely, lovely compliment.
it
And
made,
particularly, go ahead.
no, I'll go ahead, particularly.
Just particularly coming after that really very moving story about your father, which reminded me of, we've all been listening, I think, to music in a different way during this period, and we've all found, I think, different pathways and different different artists and performers and compositions and so forth. But it reminded me, there's something that William Arms Fisher, who was he turned the Largo of Dvorak's New World Symphony into a Negro spiritual. Absolutely beautiful piece that I started playing a lot on the piano during the pandemic. And he said something that's just been resonating with me throughout this whole period, and that came into my mind when you were talking about your own father. Blessed are the music makers, for they shall uplift and unite the earth. And that is really, I think if we've ever, that might have seemed a little cliched a while ago, it certainly doesn't now. And it also, the other thing I've been thinking about during this period is that wonderful comment that Queen Elizabeth made after 9/11, that grief is the price we pay for love. And that's that I see in that piece that movement of Chopin's with the Funeral March, that journey from sorrow and even violence into hopefulness and joy, and then back into it's an arc that we've all I think been seeing an awful lot of lately. That combination of of love and loss, and music does speak to it in some way that it's just very hard to explain that and talk about it. In fact, I opened the book with that old canard about writing about music is like dancing about architecture. It's very
canard is a French word, so I'll leave it to you. But as you were talking about this, I know that I often use Beethoven as an example, who was to me a utopianist. He was a tortured man, but he believed in a kind of utopia, as did Michelangelo. Mm-hmm. I think that when I teach music, I often use visual arts because sometimes people can get an idea from the art. So I use Michelangelo for Beethoven, Raphael for Mozart, and Leonardo da Vinci for Bach. And
who would you use for Chopin?
I'm not there yet because I don't quite see that, and maybe you have an idea.
I think maybe a French Impressionist would be
a French Impressionist.
Possibly,
but what would be interesting about that is most of my artists come before the composers. In this case, it would be Chopin's influence on the painter, which works too.
Yeah.
But I've had Delacroix and Berlioz. There are different examples of that, and they don't fit perfectly because Delacroix could also serve for Saint-Saëns. But I wanted to, with Beethoven, point out the fact that with him, the music is often darkness to light. And the Chopin Opus 35, we might describe, and if you disagree, please tell me, darkness, light, darkness.
That movement, yes, but you could argue that the last movement, that very wacky finale, he described it, Chopin, in a letter to a friend, as the right hand and the left hand gossiping after the march, which always conjures for me the idea of a couple of old ladies over the hedge after walking out of the church from the funeral, he was really such a great guy, whatever. So I don't know, that, and he leaves you in this, kind of crazy athematic rumbling of confusion. But it's very quick and very impressionistic, actually, and it sounds very improvisational too, and goes up and down. So I don't know, but I think you're right that does, like in the B minor scherzo, that is a piece I talked about earlier that he wrote right after he left Poland for the last time. He was in a very difficult moment psychologically, and he had left his family, and it was Christmas, and he was in his church, and he was just so depressed and so alone. And there was a revolution that was, the Russians were rampaging through the streets of Warsaw. And so this piece, it starts out with this howl at the top of the keyboard, and then it goes into this, then suddenly you're in the middle of this lullaby. I have a friend from college who's been emailing me for the past year about Opus 35 because he's also fascinated with it. And he hears in the trio, the D flat major interlude, he hears a lullaby. And I think that's really interesting, because that, this idea that you're sort of going through this anguish, and then you're then you're being kind of cradled, and then you're thrown back into it. It is something that he frequently did, and that, you're right, that's different from Beethoven.
And new, and I think revolutionary. I'm sure people did it before. I mean, I would point, there are certain Mozart piano concerti where they're not necessarily resolved in a positive way, but in a question mark kind of way. But this leads me directly to what I consider a cardinal point in all studying of music, but especially in the case of Chopin. Chopin he wrote a few songs, but most of his work is based on pure music rather than spoken language and music together, the way many composers did. And he wrote mostly, quote, smaller works. He wrote 2 piano concerti, but he primarily wrote for solo piano, the solo voice, in different forms, mazurkas and preludes and etudes and polonaises, and especially nocturnes. And I mentioned the nocturne night music because for many, many years, I'm a night owl. I would write at night, and my recording that was always on my CD player on repeat was Claudio Arau's performance of the Chopin nocturnes. To me, that was the perfect music to write by. Even if I was not writing about music, I could be writing a cookbook. But that music at night when I wrote was the perfect focus music, mood music, steadying music for me. And we know that Chopin did not perform too many performances in large theaters. And even then they were smaller. So the Salle Pleyel in Paris, where he performed, only had 300 seats, but that was already a large theater. And most of the music that he performed, when he performed, was in salons and small settings. Do you feel, because words are not there to tell us, that he was using this intimacy, this new form, to create something new in music that was not chamber music, because that's played with other people, but one person and one instrument, not singing, and a small group of listeners? A pod, if we want to use pandemic language now.
I think, one of the things that I really admired about Chopin, still admire about him, and one of the things that motivated my writing of this book was the way that all through his life, he was pressured by everyone who knew and loved him, his parents, his sister, his teacher, his friends. Everybody said, write in the big forms, write cantatas and masses and oratorios and symphonies, write the great opera of Poland. And, throughout his youth and early growing up, he listened to all those people. There are these touching letters back and forth with his teacher, Joseph Elsner, where he finally says to him, I have this kind of humble desire to create a world of my own. And for him, the piano was the instrument that could say everything that he had to say, that he wanted to say. He did write a number of pieces for orchestra, mainly before he left Warsaw, left Poland. But the piano was also, I have a whole chapter in the book devoted to the development of the piano, because of course you can't talk about Chopin without talking about the development of the piano and the technology, the technological innovations that were enabling it to become an instrument that could sing, that really could. And that was always the goal, even in the time of Bach, writes about the singing tone. And so the piano that he favored the most was the Pleyel, which was the softest of and sort of the most delicate. And these older pianos, I won't go into this at length, but in the book, I use this extraordinary place in Massachusetts called the Frederick Collection of Historic Pianos to tell the story of piano development in the 19th century in Europe, where there were piano factories all over the continent, and hundreds of them. And every different country put out a piano that sounded different. So countries had their own sounds, and the piano makers in Vienna didn't care what the audiences in Paris liked. They cared what the audiences in Vienna liked, and so forth. For Chopin, I think the instrument, he was always criticized for having a kind of a very soft tone, for not being audible. And he dealt with a lot of that criticism, and finally he just kind of walked away from it. And he just decided that he wasn't going to perform in concerts, that was not where his art was going to flourish. And I think I think it's remarkable for a couple of reasons. Again, going back to the connection between, or the statement I made earlier about how I think Chopin would sort of, in a way, recognize our society now. I think if you think about Lang Lang just saying, you know what, I'm not going to concertize anymore. I'm not going to make records. I'm going to go off and I'm going to do make my own music by myself, or for my very small cadre of intimate people. That would be extraordinary. The pressures that are on artists now to have social media accounts and to put out records all the time and to tour and to be on social media and all of that. It wasn't that, it's different, of course, now and then, but I think the pressures on Chopin were not terribly unlike the pressures that are on modern performers now. So that gesture of saying, I want to go find a world of my own, I think we have to understand it in some way. We have to have our own moment. A culture of virtuosity, which is what we live in now, or a culture of bloviation, if you like. It was very much like that then, in the press, in the in the culture. And so, to me, his decision to do that was an act of great artistic creativity, independence, and personal character that I hugely admire. And maybe that's in part because of the moment that I'm living in right now.
One of the many things I loved about your book is that you sidestep or completely ignore and create a world of your own, something that I feel is a burden on those of us who want to love and share music. And that is what I will call the critical inheritance. We, when we want to know about music, often go back and don't necessarily read the scores or listen to performances, but we read what Hector Berlioz wrote about a colleague, or what George Bernard Shaw wrote, or any number of critics all along the spectrum. And though they may have been fascinating, for me especially, Berlioz was very insightful.
Yeah, fascinating.
But he had a chip on his shoulder because he knew that he knew more than everybody around him. Most critics don't take that approach. But if, for example, with Tchaikovsky, someone would write about him, well, because he was gay, he was naturally depressed because he was unhappy with his state, and that therefore he must have committed suicide. This has been passed down also because he would write, the last symphony would be called the Pathétique, the Pathetic Symphony. Now, pathos does not necessarily mean depression,
right.
But when we or others who don't make that distinction between pathétique and pathos and pathetic, we make assumptions. And I find myself all the time still having to defend certain composers, especially Rossini, who is considered light and frivolous, when in fact I could make the argument that he was one of the great influencers who did things that then Wagner, Verdi, Meyerbeer, and many other people picked up from. Rossini did them first and radically, but because he had the famous personality of being fun-loving and eating a lot and sociable, even though he was famously a depressive, we have this received information that's very out of date, and I feel does a disservice to composers and their works, painters and their works, writers and their works, in that sometimes we invest too much biography, but sort of a Wikipedia type biography rather than a deep biography. And so in your book, you certainly work as a biographer, but that is not the driving force in the book. The driving force in the book happens to be the Opus 35 Sonata and what it inspired in you and what you found it inspired in others. Cab Calloway. It's everywhere.
Yeah.
And I say this because I would like readers who get this book, as I hope they will, to not expect that it will do what other books do for you. That's why, for me, it was just such a refreshing and eye-opening experience to read the book. Let's talk a bit about what you call a pianopolis, about the evolution of the piano, because yes, had he gone to Vienna to live in Vienna instead of Paris, he might have been a different composer in terms of his sound, in terms of the feeling of the keyboard.
Yeah.
And this is something that's seldom discussed. Most musical instruments can be transported, the violin, the trumpet, even the cello. Right. But the pianos tend to stay where they are unless you're Vladimir Horowitz or certain very famous musicians who travel with their pianos. Opera singers travel with their instrument right here.
Right.
But the piano is different.
Yeah.
And when an artist arrives in a new city with a new piano, he or she has to either specify what is desired or make adjustments, often in the moment, not only to the instrument, but to the hall.
Yeah. Yeah, this is actually one of the reasons why, again, in the when you asked me for a couple of recordings, I chose Keith Jarrett's Cone concert, because I write about in the book about how Chopin was working with a really lousy piano in Majorca when he was working on the Preludes, Opus 28. And Chopin, unlike a lot of other composers, Chopin really worked at the piano. He didn't work away from the piano like Bach did, for instance. But Bach wrote some portion of the first book of the Well-Tempered Clavier in a prison in Weimar without any piano at all. Mm-hmm. And Jarrett, when he went to Cologne, he hadn't slept in 2 days. The concert started at 11:30 because the opera house had never had a jazz musician before, and so they had to get through the opera and get the audience out and get them back in again. And he gets on the stage and it's this really crappy piano. It's tinny, the pedals don't work properly, and so his back was really bothering him. But he used his manager later said in an interview, he really used this ill-suited piano to alter the music that he made in that concert. He worked with the instrument. He didn't fight it because that was what he had. And he also, he started off with almost kind of a musical joke with the signal tone of the opera house itself. So you can hear people laughing a little bit in the beginning of the Cone concert. And it's a great reminder of how, we think you go to a concert and you put on your nice dress or your suit and tie, whatever, and you go and you sit there in this, and you really have these great expectations. And the artist might be dealing with things that you have no way of knowing, like a really ill-suited piano. And so, yeah, that's a real issue. But the thing with the development of the piano that I found so fascinating is this idea that throughout up until about like the late 1850s, when Steinway patented the overstrung piano, which really changed everything, you really had a whole different sonic universe, and that's lost to us now, unless you go to a place like the Frederick Collection, where they keep the pianos in playable condition for scholars and musicians. People record on them. And they really, it's a married couple named Michael and Patricia Frederick. They're really great pianists themselves. She has a beautiful singing voice, so she often sings. She actually told me a story once recently that you might enjoy about Schubert's Erlkönig, where the human voice in that song has to mimic like 4 different characters: a little boy, a father. That's devil. What the piano, the devil. That's what the piano could do in those, because of those pianos were so they had a whole different sort of tonal universe, and the left hand could be playing an almost different tonality than the right hand, and because of the parallel stringing, you didn't get so much noise that you get with like a modern Steinway. And so and that's what they do when you go to visit them. They start you in the 1920s and then they play the same pieces of music written during the period that the piano was made in, and they go backwards in time through all these different piano makes, and they make you listen, they make you hear the different, the way, say, and they have an Erard piano, which was the other French brand that Chopin loved, that has this very rich bass, but this really kind of tinkling upper register. We don't really, after the Industrial Revolution, everything was made to be sort of smoothed out, and that's what Steinway did so brilliantly. And Steinway pianos are wonderful and gorgeous. I have one myself. They're obviously.
I see it.
But it's so important to understand that that question of did the pianos push the music, or did the composers push the pianos? It's one of those chicken and egg questions that people always, did Beethoven, he was breaking strings and writing notes that didn't exist on the keyboard. Obviously that pushed the development forward, but it really was a whole different universe than what we know today. And what we hear today is a homogeneous sound. That's not necessarily a value judgment. But it's really it affects the way that we understand that music and the circumstances and the era and the time in which it was created.
You were talking before about Dvorak's Largo from the Ninth Symphony from the New World, which was composed here in New York and premiered at Carnegie Hall. And he had a beloved pupil named Harry T. Burleigh, Burleigh, who was African-American. And Dvorak was very modern and great in the fact that he would take a Black pupil at a time when people were not doing that. And in fact, Harry T. Burleigh also not only shared with him the Largo, the going home, the spiritual that we spoke of, but Harry T. Burleigh took what he learned from Dvorak and taught classical musicians, taught jazz musicians. He was a great theorist in the sense of music theory. And one of the people who studied him, I don't know if they ever met, Duke Ellington was born in Washington, D.C. Harry T. Burleigh spent time teaching in Washington, D.C., and they may have come across each other. But Harry T. Burleigh spoke of the keyboard of the piano, of the so-called white notes and black notes, and he invested in them a racial sensibility in the fact that he referred to the black notes, the black keys, as the pentatonic scale, and referred to these notes as being the music of African derivation, even though we know that they were codified perhaps in Italy and then elsewhere in Europe. But obviously music is universal, even if they're codified in one place, if it's codified in one place. And he said, Harry T. Burleigh said, that the white notes were the European influence and the melodic element, and the black notes were the soul, the substance, the contrast. And a lot of people say that people like Ellington, who was a scholar, and Louis Armstrong, who was a natural, and others came to understand this musicology out of Harry T. Burleigh, who came out of Antonin Dvorak here in New York City.
Wow.
So that's why we want to live very long lives so that we can study all of this stuff.
Absolutely.
And share it.
I know that you're a great lover of ragas, aren't you?
I am a great lover of ragas, morning ragas, afternoon ragas, evening ragas. I did a program a few years ago in Verbier in the festival in Switzerland with the sitarist Anushka Shankar, the daughter of Ravi Shankar. And it was basically the transition of string music from India to Spain. With the idea of the gypsies, the people, another word is Roma, people who came from India and traveled west and went into what is Syria, and then into the Balkans, and then to Hungary, where they created the zither. The word sitar, I forget the word in Syria, but then zither became kitara, guitar, by the time it got to Spain. And the influences of this music, and she sat on the stage with various instruments around her, and I lectured and taught each transition as she played often the same music all the way from India to Andalusia.
Wow.
So yeah,
Wow.
ragas are terrific
Yeah.
music.
Well, it's, we saw Ann and I went in at the Hudson Opera House in Hudson. We heard Terry Riley's In C with Brooklyn Raga Massive. That such an extraordinary piece. I mean, I was thinking about it when you were talking about the sort of the fixed keyboard of the piano, which obviously can conjure an entire universe, but those other instruments that can play the microtones and there's a whole other universe beyond the pianistic universe.
That's why when I listened to song recitals and you would have men who are conductors, not only men, but mentioning too, Daniel Barenboim and James Levine, who as orchestral conductors bring the orchestra to the 88 notes of the piano, 88 keys of the piano. Right. And you can hear that they hear an orchestra there. Mm-hmm. Whereas someone who strictly focuses on playing the music as written, the word I don't use anymore is accompanist, now musical partner, musical collaborator, brings a very different sensibility. And I don't know where Chopin would land on that. It brings me to a topic, and then we can talk about her. One of the great artistic figures of that era in Chopin's time in Paris is someone who my friend Marilyn Horn has studied a lot and done albums of her music, was the composer, pianist, mezzo-soprano Pauline Viardot, Viardot. And Pauline Viardot was the sister of the famous mezzo-soprano and girlfriend of Rossini, Maria Malibran. And they were daughters of Manuel Garcia, a great Spanish, moved to France, singer and singing teacher. The Garcia family came to New York very early on and did the first performance here of Don Giovanni in the presence of Lorenzo da Ponte, the librettist, here in New York City. And so Viardot grew up in this musical family, but her first love was really not singing, it was the piano. Mm-hmm. And her frequent piano partner on four hands or just studying or playing for one another was Chopin.
Yeah, yeah.
And he loved her singing. He loved opera, by the way. Mm-hmm. I think particularly.
Oh my God, yeah,
Bellini.
yeah. Yeah.
What do you know? I don't know too much about Chopin going to the opera in Paris. Do you know anything?
Oh, he went every night, practically. Not every night, but I mean, yeah, no, he was an avid opera goer, and he prized the human voice really above everything. I think Bellini was his favorite composer.
Bellini died in France in 1834.
Yeah, okay.
So it was right at the same time.
Right.
Norma came out in 1831.
Yeah. And of course, Pauline Viardot. Now, this is actually something that I know you and I've talked a little bit about, but about Chopin's funeral. And I know you were.
Let's hold the funeral for the end.
Fine. Okay. All right. Hold it. But that's my knowledge of his. Okay.
But in reading your book, I saw a name and then I went and studied her a bit, Jane Sterling, who was Scottish. And after he parted with George Sand, he was reputed, it was said that perhaps they were lovers, although they probably were not, but they were close friends. She was his student. She loved him and fronted a lot of the money for him when he was impoverished. And she paid for his whole funeral.
That's right.
And she was the person who gathered his works and helped create the catalog and have us have his works today.
Yeah.
She lived 1804 to 1859. People didn't always live that long at that time.
No. And she really,
Yeah. She really what?
I mean, when he went to England and Scotland in 1840, and there was another cholera outbreak in Paris in 1840. There were revolutions. It was a very unsettled time, and Chopin went to England, and he writes his letters. They're kind of heartbreaking because it was so difficult for him. He was very sick. He was a huge celebrity under enormous pressure to perform. He actually disguised himself and called himself Mr. Fritz. But as soon as he sat down at the piano, everybody knew who it was. And Schumann said that too. Actually, Schumann said, all you have to do is play a few notes and you know who it is, because the music is so distinctive. But she set up that whole trip, which both completely exhausted him, but also made him a certain amount of money and allowed him to get out of Paris. And but he talks about my Scottish ladies, and they were just constantly fussing over him. And it sounds kind of horrible to me, and I think it was sort of horrible to him. But I guess it was And then he came back, and the next year he died. So, and she did pay for his funeral.
She did indeed. Now, I just want to mention one more thing about him, although we could talk endlessly. Two more things. One is, I want listeners to go, number one, to look at the works and listen to the works on Adagio that you recommended. You mentioned a couple of them. They're by Bach, Chopin, Keith Jarrett, and Bill Evans. Is something you're listening to now. Peace, P-E-A-C-E, Peace, P-I-E-C-E, played by Jean-Yves Thibaudet. And you told me that you're listening to this a lot now after the lockdown began.
Mm-hmm. I am. And this is a piece actually that I've never found a quotation from Bill Evans himself attributing any kind of compositional debt to Chopin, but it's been written about widely that this piece was inspired by Chopin's Berceuse, which was Opus 57. And it's just a really, really gorgeous. It sounds like an improvisation. It sounds Chopin-esque actually, because it has this very improvisational quality. And there are a number of really great recordings, but the Thibaudet has actually become my favorite, and Adagio has a number of them.
The Why Chopin, W-H-Y Chopin.com website that you've created. I don't want listeners to cheat and just go to the website. I want them to read the book, read a chapter, then go to the music, then read the next chapter, then go to the music. It works much, much better.
But I will say, if I could once say about the website, is that one of the reasons that I did this was to present a wide array of types of performances, from jazz arrangements of his work, modern song arrangements of his works, and performances on period pianos, performances on, there's a wonderful Polish jazz guitarist named Adam Palma who does really wonderful work. So that the idea of the website is that you go and you can listen. I've organized it by chapter with page numbers for really super easy reference. So you can listen to a piece straight through by Maurizio Pollini or Marta Argerich or Mitsuko Oshida or whoever. But also then there are maybe 2 or 3 other recordings that are like by Jacques Lussier, who was a great French improviser. And so the idea is that you kind of enter this world, not only the world of Chopin's music, but also the legacy that we are so lucky to have now in so broad and in inventive ways. So that's the idea behind the website. And when you were talking about doing that for Michelangelo, when we were talking about that book, you were way ahead of your time in that, because the technology didn't really exist. Now it's really very easy. This website that I built, it's responsive, so it knows what screen you're using. If you're on a phone, it shrinks down. If you're on a desktop, it enlarges, and it makes it very easy to just sit with your lap and tap a thing. You don't even have to leave. YouTube allows you to play right there in the web page.
And also, it was queued up to the moment that you wanted us to hear. So
yes,
rather
right.
than hearing the first 14 minutes of something, although we can go right to that spot
Right.
at 14 minutes and 42 seconds where the example is, which was well done.
And that's another thing YouTube allows you to do now, which is really fantastic.
You could have chosen any pianist for our first hearing of the Opus 35, and you chose Vladimir Horowitz from 1978 in a performance at the White House in front of Rosalind and Jimmy Carter and an audience, back when classical musicians were invited to the White House and were not afraid of catching some
Yeah.
terrible disease by stepping foot in there, but we're not going there.
Okay. All right.
Not too much. But why that recording? Why that performance by Horowitz?
Well, there's something that Horowitz does at the end of the second statement of the Funeral March, so at the very end of the third movement, that is unlike what anybody else does. So most pianists try to bring out that rumble, the drum roll, because it's dramatic and it sounds like a stately funeral march. What Horowitz does is he brings out the right hand. He brings down this descending, it's an arpeggio, and he just sings it, and it's very lovely, and it goes da 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 da. It's mournful. It's not heroic, and it's really hard to do. I mean, I've tried when I was learning it with my teacher. I don't have huge hands. I have, for a woman, probably, medium, normal sized hands. Horowitz had those huge long fingers, and he had that modified piano, and so he was able to do this. And it really changes the way you listen to the ending of that piece, I think, because in a way, and he was going against all the tradition. The tradition was to really bring out that more kind of heroic quality. It's also, that was a really important moment in the history of music in our country, because it was the first broadcast of that great series, Great Performances in the White House. Jim Lehrer of PBS did a stand-up live on the White House lawn. It was the first time in history that an artist had been invited to play at the White House without being part of some other event, like a gala state dinner. The purpose of the event was Vladimir Horowitz, and it's astonishing to think of it now. But one of the very first things that Jimmy Carter did after he was inaugurated was sit down at the Resolute desk and write a letter to Vladimir Horowitz and invite him to the White House to play the piano. That was one of his first acts. And so it really, it kicked off this long tradition on PBS and in the White House of all different kinds of musicians, from jazz, popular song, you name it. Every possible type of musician came there until 2016, and then it went dark. There has not been any performance at the White House but it will come back at some point.
Yep.
But Jimmy
if
Carter,
there's a President
Biden,
I want to be his music advisor.
Well, it's not. No, would be a great job.
Yeah, I would. I mean, I really believe
yeah.
the culture that the place has to be fumigated, not only from germs, but it has to bring the positive feeling of music of all kinds to the White House. But as I said, not too much politics.
But Republican presidents also were very, Reagan also brought Horowitz to the White House.
A lot.
This was an absolutely bipartisan. This idea that music inspired our leaders, lifted them up, is something we lost. And yeah,
I knew Nancy Reagan, and she was a very serious lover of opera. And I didn't go to politics with her terribly much, but we shared this love of opera. And when I worked at the Metropolitan Opera, several times I welcomed her there on sort of a private visit where the security precautions would be taken, but it would more be that her assistant would call my office and Mrs. Reagan would like to come next week, and whatever you have to do, just do it. She was very down to earth, and she genuinely loved the art form. It's not that she had to do that when she came to New York. She wanted to. So, and George Bush Sr. loved opera. Barbara,
that's right.
Also a bit. But George Bush Sr. certainly loved opera. Bill Clinton and Hillary, I once saw at a performance of Aida at the Met, so it happens. But I had a very, very, very brief email exchange once with Jimmy Carter, where I was doing an article and I wanted to ask him about music in the White House. And I wrote to him, do you have a favorite opera singer, opera composer? And he wrote back, and I'm paraphrasing, that he wanted to be diplomatic and not single one out or another out. He said, however, what I play at home is Morella Freni. So, so I was able to tell her that, and she was very gratified.
That's great. But there's a wonderful documentary that's just out about it. It's called Jimmy Carter, Rock and Roll President. It's not a good title because it covers so much more than just rock and roll. But Jimmy Carter just lived a life of music that it's a great story.
Yeah, I know.
It's a wonderful
But
movie.
anyway, I wanted to ask you about Horowitz in that performance. I had the honor of working with him on numerous occasions, and I can't say I knew him well, but I knew him intimately in the sense that I was with him in his home and in his dressing room, and we had conversations about music. I'm the one who had to deliver his fee at the end of a performance.
Oh,
So I
wow.
got to know him pretty well and was very admiring of him, and he was quite the character. And his wife, Wanda, was Toscanini's daughter.
Yeah, right. She was a
And
real battle axe.
yeah, and they are all buried together with Toscanini in Milan. But so I got to watch him in rehearsal. And what struck me in this performance, there was a lot less drama in his hands. And he was sort of caressing the keys, whereas often he'd use a certain amount of power and a lot of pedal. And, but I don't know if he was nervous because he suffered from nerves, but
yes, he did.
The way his hands worked in this was so very different. Maybe because the sound technician thought it wouldn't translate well in a live broadcast. But the way you described his right hand is exactly what I noticed when I watched the video. And the very end of the sonata, which is that crazy music, is he did with all the virtuosity that one would expect of Vladimir Horowitz. But did it strike you that his hands were very special in this particular performance?
You know, I hadn't really noticed that, except one of the things that I love about that performance, and maybe there's a sort of stateliness about the way that he addressed the instrument that usually is the way he was, and I really favor that. I hate histrionics in pianists, but there's a backstory there. You know, you mentioned a technician. Actually, what happened, and this again, you can't imagine this happening today. When Horowitz got to the White House, Jimmy Carter said, "Hey, do you want to come up and see the residence?" Which was like a really big honor. He's like, no, I don't want to see the residence. I want to see the piano. So they go into the East Room, and he sits down to start playing the piano, and it sounds terrible. It's like the Keith Jarrett thing. It's sort of, the acoustics are really lousy in the hall. So yes. Rosalind Carter remembers that in the attic, there are all these carpets. And so Jimmy Carter, Rosalind Carter, First Lady of the United States, with a couple of ushers, they go upstairs to the White House attic. They come downstairs carrying all these carpets, and they start laying them down on the floor. Horowitz would play a few notes, and Jimmy Carter wrote about this. He said, with our butts in the air, we would, we would move the carpet. Horowitz would play a note. He'd say, no, move it a little. They'd move it a little. Finally, they got it to the place that Horowitz was happy, and he had so it really was a joint, very improvised acoustical miracle that thing got, to Horowitz's satisfaction.
Was it Horowitz's piano or was it the White House
yes.
piano?
Yeah, it was CD 503.
Because he lived on East 94th Street.
Yeah.
And I went to his home several times. He lived on East 94th Street and had a picture window in his townhouse.
Yeah.
And we would have to go and remove the window.
Right.
And bring out both the pianos to the Met the Sunday before for him to come to the Met to play the pianos and move everything around endlessly, right. Inches. Yeah. And then the pianos would have to be returned to his apartment, his home, tuned again, the window reinstalled. And then the following Saturday, the pianos would be brought out again, the windows removed. So it was quite the process.
Yeah.
And he loved, standing there and watching people move things about. Yeah. I did it all the time for him, along with stagehands. But the Met has a wonderful acoustic, but the White House must have been a challenge to him.
But that piano itself is very famous, of course. And it tours now, and Steinway sends it all over the country. And I actually played it a couple of last summer. At Steinway Hall, the new one on 6th Avenue. Yep. And they let you in there. You have to book an appointment, and you sit there in this auditorium and you play his. And the action is so light that it's almost hard. It was very hard for me to get used to it because it was so unlike the typical Steinway, where there's a lot more resistance in the keys.
So one little footnote before, and by the way, your book is beautifully footnoted, more than most.
Thank you.
So I went and read all of those as well.
Oh, good. You're a great reader, Fred. That's really.
I am a very careful
reader. Authors write
book,
for people like you who read.
When the book is good, it's it's a good, pleasurable thing to do. And I want readers to know listeners to know November 20th, I'm having Alex Ross come to talk about his book about
fantastic.
Wagner.
So the
It
book
is a fantastic,
fabulous.
I mean, I've begun, but one really needs
Yeah.
Wagnerian amounts of time to
Yeah.
do it. And it's a wonderful book.
But it's
So
a book
November-
about culture. I mean, that's
Yeah.
the thing. It's a book about Wagner, but it's a book about culture and the impact, the legacy, and,
Yeah.
and often misunderstood, you know,
Yeah.
what we sort of think we understand.
The footnote is, my name is Frederick, and my parents agreed that that would be my name, and they chose 4 individuals for whom I would be named, and one of them was Chopin.
Really?
Yes.
I
And
did not know that.
the others were a famous writer, philosopher, psychologist in the 1950s named Frederick Wortham, who my mother finds very inspiring. And the other was the composer, British composer, Frederick Delius. And my parents didn't quite agree on Wortham and Delius, and they both love Chopin. But ultimately, they said, I'm named for Fred Astaire. However, they didn't want me to be Fred. They wanted me to be Frederick. And they wanted the spelling to be as Chopin spells it, F-R-E accent, D-E accent, R-I-C. I had the misfortune from a name point of view to have a German nurse in the hospital where I was born, and she wrote the spelling in the German spelling of Frederick with a K.
Uh-huh.
And so and without the accent marks.
I see. Okay.
So I'm Frederick in that way, but the intention was that it be for Chopin.
Well, that's his French rendering, of course. His name in Polish is Frydyrk.
That German nurse would not be able to.
She would not have known, and she probably wouldn't have wanted to go there into the Polish thing with the German thing too.
Now, so I have anticipated for our listeners Chopin's funeral, which is one of the great cultural landmarks of the 19th century. And when you and I began talking in preparation for today, I mentioned to you that purely by coincidence, on October 30th of 1999, in other words, 150 years to the date after Chopin's funeral, I happened to be in Paris. I was there with an Italian friend, and she and I noticed in walking by the Church of the Madeleine that Chopin's funeral was going to be done again, 150 years. I loved the French for many things, and one of them was that they would have the preparation and the organization and the passion to redo Chopin's funeral and play the music that was played back then. Frankly, because I didn't have my musicological hat on that day, but my French "isn't it nice to be in Paris" hat on.
Yeah. With a lovely woman.
Yes, I didn't go with that in mind. We went just because it was there and we were together, and she likes music, but she was there to study at a cooking school.
Mm-hmm.
And I went to some of her classes, and it was a very nice week. But we went to his funeral long before you and I had ever, many years, 20 years before you and I ever discussed the notion of Chopin. And so I unexpectedly have a rather unique insight into Chopin's funeral. But I want you, rather than myself, to talk about Chopin's funeral, October 30th, 1849.
Well, he died on October 17th. And
tomorrow, in other words.
Tomorrow, right, exactly. Tomorrow will be the 170th, I think, anniversary of his, 171st. And it took, for almost 2 full weeks, his very famous, well-placed friends argued with the Archbishop of Paris to allow women to sing the Mozart Requiem in the church, because as a relic of French Catholic tradition, women were not allowed to sing with the church choir. And so finally, the Archbishop gave his permission, but there was a hitch, which required that the women sing behind a black curtain. And so, and this was really one of the only things that Chopin requested about his funeral, was that the Mozart Requiem be sung. And so that's what it was. It was Pauline Viardot, whom you spoke about early, and Louis Lablache, who had actually sung the Requiem at the interment for Napoleon 10 years earlier. And he also sung it at Beethoven's funeral in Vienna. And so, what for me was so sort of, kind of, I wondered how many people sitting in that church that day appreciated the irony of a man who had spent 9 years living with France's most notorious feminist, having his funeral requiem sung by women who were hidden behind a curtain, whereas the men were not. They were out there, and so the voices must have been somewhat disembodied and muffled, and it must have been a somewhat strange experience. But for me, the really fascinating question about Chopin's funeral was what it sounded like to hear his two preludes, the E minor and the B minor prelude, played on the organ. And it's very hard to get a good recording of these works played on the organ. I did find a really wonderful young organist named Stephen Price, who was at a university in Indiana, who recorded them for me on his university organ, made a good recording, and that's on the website in the chapter 7, the last chapter at the funeral. But what was sort of really surprising to me was I discovered in the course of my research, I went to St. John the Divine, the great cathedral in New York, which was actually the first architect was my great grandfather, C. Grant LaFarge. And so I went there, and the associate organ director took me up to the organ loft, and he played those pieces on the organ so I could hear them in a grand, huge cathedral. And one of the things that he told me when we were talking about it was that in that period, in the 1830s and the 1840s, again, when Paris was the capital of the 19th century, people went to church to hear improvisations, to hear popular music, to hear all kinds of popular song on the organ. It was not just church music. I thought that hearing Chopin's works on an organ would be very startling in a church setting. But in fact, that was what the people of Paris really loved to hear. And Welly, Louis Lefebvre Welly, who was the organist, was really the greatest improviser on the organ in Paris. No one was better suited to send off Frédéric Chopin, the greatest piano improviser, than Welly was. And so he played those two preludes. And it really, I think it must have just been an extraordinary moment, followed then by an orchestral version of the funeral march. Chopin, we haven't talked about this. This was one of the surprises I learned during the course of my research, is that towards the very end of the manuscripts that Chopin sent to his publisher, he crossed out the word funèbre, funeral in French, and he left it at just marche. So this left one of the great Chopin scholars, Jeffrey Kalberg, to wonder, is the world's most famous funeral march really a funeral march at all? Because Chopin removed the word funeral before he sent it off to his publisher. But after his funeral, the deal was sealed, and it forever became known as Chopin's Funeral March. It had been orchestrated for strings by one of his friends, a French composer named Henri Rebert, and that must have just been kind of extraordinary. A lot of people in the church had heard him play it in salons. So to then hear this music played on the grand organ, not the grand organ, the great orchestra, must have just been really wild.
Well, I wonder whether it made it, I'll try to find the right adjective, stratospheric, exponential, that this intimate work at his departure suddenly became something much bigger.
Yeah, it's almost like he had been fighting his whole life to not have to do that, and that's what was done. And it's a kind of a fascinating ending to the story of that work. But one does wonder. I sometimes wonder what he would have thought of that. I think he probably would have loved the way his prelude sounded on that organ. But the funeral march, and they did play the trio. They did play the orchestra, the entire movement. So they went through the D flat major, D flat minor, D flat major, B flat minor sections. And I've heard it, a number of other, Elgar did a transcription that's easy to find online, and there are other versions of it. But I have the score, Reber's original score, but I've never heard it. I mean, you did hear it in the church that day, and
but as I said to you, I was not thinking musicologically at the time.
I know.
But
you had your mind on more important things, food and women.
You and I have both spoken for a nice period now, but we've not even quoted the music because we're going on the assumption that all of our listeners know the music we're talking about. Da 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 dee da dee da dee da dee was the famous theme. It has been echoed and played throughout history in so many different ways. And my question for you is, do you think the fact that it has become so ubiquitous may have robbed it subsequently of its original power and impact because it's so familiar, like the Lone Ranger theme from Rossini's William Tell?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I think that's one of the reasons that I was so interested to write this book, because most people really don't know this. I mean, unless you're somebody who goes to hear piano recitals, or you're a musician yourself and you play the work. It is an astonishing. When I first heard it, I heard it in the Polish consulate in New York. Played by Michael Kimmelman, the great architecture critic for the New York Times, who was a brilliant pianist and almost became a professional pianist before he became a journalist. And when I had never heard the sonata before, and when he got to the funeral march, and I thought, oh, this is where this music is from. I mean, I really didn't even know that. I knew it was Chopin's funeral march, but I didn't know what work it was from. And then he stopped and he played the trio, and then he came back to the march, and I was gobsmacked. I thought, well, this is just a whole different story than I had ever understood. And then there is musically there is a story there. He is telling a story that is very, very different from the sort of the very pared down, mournful, heroic dirge. But I think it's also its legacy in popular culture tends to be more, it's what our parents' generation knew during the horribly sad funeral of John F. Kennedy. We think of the riderless horse going through Washington and Chopin's funeral march being played by a brass band. Or in my generation, it was, in the old Looney Tunes cartoon, when something really bad was going to happen, like Sylvester the cat was going to be executed. And so it did, and there's a Pilot Pen commercial that, I mean, there's all kinds of pop culture versions. When we were kids, we used to sing "Pray for the Dead and the Dead will pray for you," simply because they have nothing else to do. But there is a whole different story, and there's a whole compositional story, and he wrote that movement over a period of 3 years, and the D flat major part, the trio, the lovely nocturne-like song, he actually wrote first, and that has a connection to his leaving Poland. And so there's a lot of elements to this story that I think needed to kind of be restored and put all together. So you could say, okay, so that's what that piece really is. That's the story that piece tells.
And that's the part of Chasing Chopin that I chose not to talk about, because I want readers to discover it in your beautiful prose. I have one last question. There are famous figures in history whose anatomical parts have taken on lives of their own. Napoleon's private parts, Einstein's brain, Chopin's heart. Would you tell the story of Chopin's heart after the funeral?
Well, this was the other one of the other requests that Chopin made. After there was a tradition of what's called heart burial in particularly in Poland. I mean, Paderewski also, his heart was buried and is still actually in the United States. He asked that his heart be removed from his body after he died, and sent back to Poland. And so that's his sister. There's a great story. I won't go into it. But if anybody has read Olga Tokarczuk's, the recent Nobel Prize winner, her luminous book, Flights, she tells the story of Ludwika, Chopin's sister, crossing the border with the heart secreted in her voluminous skirts in a jar that probably contained cognac, past these border guards.
A crystal jar, yes.
A crystal jar. She gets past the border guards. And then it sort of sat around because there was an issue with her husband, who was sort of jealous of Chopin. And it was interred in a small ebony box in the 1850s, and it was placed in a catacomb at the Church of the Holy Cross in Warsaw. And then in 1879, it was discovered by a journalist. And so then it was interred in a pillar in the church, with a line from the book of Matthew, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. That's a paraphrase, but that's, and then it was removed again by, this is a very strange part of the story, by a Nazi, music-loving Nazi high-up official who knew that the church was going to be bombed. And so they removed the heart. The church was bombed. It was then rebuilt. And then in the, I think in 1845, it was reinstalled in that pillar.
1945.
1945. It was reinstalled. There was a procession that went through Żelazowa, which was the birth town of Chopin. And there was a concert in his home. And then it was returned. And so it's been in the pillar. It was removed a couple of years ago, and an autopsy was conducted on it. I mean, not an autopsy, a visual autopsy. And it was determined that he did die of tuberculosis, which had been under there were some other speculations. And it's now back in the pillar. And I think maybe in 50 years, it will be taken out again.
2068, you wrote.
2068. So then they think that maybe they'll have the technology to be able to do a DNA analysis without invading the jar. But the heart has made, it made this very, very long and strange journey. And it's quite moving. I haven't been there to see it, but I intend to go very soon.
Annik LaFarge, author of Chasing Chopin,
Thank
a
you,
musical
Fred.
journey across 3 centuries, 4 countries, and a half dozen revolutions. Thank you for this beautiful book and this illuminating talk. It's something that people who want to know about Chopin in the future can come back and listen to and watch, and they will learn a lot. So
I thank you. This was really fun for me. And for any writer to talk to someone so versed in music, of course, but you're such a wonderful reader. And that's really a great pleasure, great honor to be
I'm getting good at it. But I'll be blunt. I'm a wonderful reader of books I like.
Well, that's probably good, Fred, because
there are certain very famous books in the world that I just cannot crack. I've tried them.
Yeah, well,
I can't.
Yeah,
but
that's
one,
okay.
So, readers, listeners, join me next Friday and every Friday for Fred Plotkin on Fridays. I have a lot of wonderful guests coming. And you can go to YouTube or to the Adagio site and enter Fred Plotkin on Fridays and see all the guests that I've had since April 24th. And stay safe, wear a mask when you go out, take all the right precautions, wash your hands, but then dry them before holding a book. Take care. See you next week.
Thank you, Fred.